Welcome everyone to 2023 Chinatown Reimagine Forum in Tujage, Montreal. My name is Jessica Chen. I'm with the JAF Foundation. We are the organizer of the forum. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Tujage, Montreal and its Chinatown is located in unceded indigenous lands of Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation, who are recognized as the custodians of the lands and water on which we gather today. So thank you for joining us from different parts of Turtle Island, also known as North America. Yesterday, we had an in-person opening of the forum right here in Montreal's Chinatown. We had a sharing circle as one of our first steps to start meaningful relationships and dialogues with the Indigenous partners about Chinatown. Stories were shared, questions of home and belonging were discussed. This year is the centennial of Canada's Exclusion Act that was introduced in 1923. We are holding this Chinatown Reimagine Forum as a unique gathering of North American Chinatowns in search for an equitable and sustainable future so that Chinatown continues to be sanctuary for those marginalized and in need for a sense of belonging. We hope that we will learn from our first people of the territory and find our way forward with an anti-colonial approach into the future. Last night, we also had a film screening of Big Fight in Little Chinatown, directed by Karen Chiu, a story of Chinatown community's resilience. And we will be discussing more of those different Chinatowns ideas and strategies to tackle some of our common challenges. With the opening of our online forum, I'm thrilled to moderate this first panel titled Chinatown is Not a Museum. So I'm here joined by our wonderful panelists, Sarah Yeung, a community developer, a policy advocate and researcher in Philadelphia and across the United States to strengthen the voice of community in policy and planning decisions. We also have Winnie Fong, who actually came into Montreal yesterday. She's an urban planner based in Los Angeles, also a co-founder of LA Community Land Trust. We have Louisa-May Khoo, a UBC public scholar currently based in Vancouver, and was the policymaker of public housing and aging governance in Singapore. Lastly, we also have Chiu, a social justice activist and a family lawyer and mediator specializing in representing low-income clients and currently a coordinator of Montreal Chinatown Roundtable. So I would like to now introduce having each one of them to start to share with us a story about why Chinatown is not a museum and how Chinatown is the living community. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to the conference organizers. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to the conference organizers for hosting this unique opportunity to gather. It's an honor to join from south of the border and represent U.S. Chinatown. So Philadelphia Chinatown is a living and cultural community. Many of our community members refer to it as an ecosystem. That's the word they use. And I think that's because there is a sense of connection between all of its parts. There's an interdependency between residents and business owners, services and organizations in the neighborhood. There is a huge spread of diversity in terms of stakeholders, languages, age, demographics, all kind of centered around the anchor of Asian and Chinese history and culture and uses. We have everything here. It is a mixed use community. People live here, people work here, people have businesses here, and you can stay in the community and not leave if that's what you choose to do. From life to death, we have what you need. We have a pregnancy center for ultrasounds, and we have a funeral parlor as well. So it is truly a rich and welcoming place, and that sense of welcoming and belonging draws people from all over the region, and it makes it a hub of commerce and culture for Asians and also from folks who are visiting and learning about the culture and enjoying anything that it has to offer. So today I'll spend a few minutes talking about a discussion around public spaces in our Chinatown. I believe there's a slideshow that should be thrown up on the screen. Should I wait for that?
Daniel, can you put on the slideshow for Sarah? Sorry, Sarah, we thought you were going to share your screen.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay, great. Okay, so this is this picture here is a picture of our kids walking from school to the daycare center after school ends. Next slide, please. So before I want to talk about our public spaces, just a little note of history about our urban renewal infrastructure. So like many North American Chinatowns, we have been impacted by highway, other large development projects that shaped the community's boundaries and created barriers for pedestrian and connection and other development in and around our Chinatown. So what you see running through the middle of the screen is actually Vine Street Expressway. That's a local highway that's a subgrade, and then on either side of the a highway is the elevated Vine Street. And so this effectively acts as a barrier between the two sides of our neighborhood since the 1980s when it was developed. So it also created barriers between where community spaces were. There are no public spaces per se in our Chinatown, but there's a park that's adjacent to the Chinatown that is similarly cut off by road infrastructure. And then there's community spaces like our church, as well as other education spaces or schools that are located on the north side, which is the right side of the screen in our Chinatown. In the 2010s, there was a group in the neighborhood that began a campaign to develop an above-ground railroad viaduct, which was at the time no longer used as a viaduct. They wanted to convert that to a park, a viaduct park called the Rail Park. And the local CDC, the Community Development Corporation at the time, had been advocating to tear down that structure to make affordable housing instead. So they advocated against the park due to the fear of its gentrifying effects and also lack of space to effectively meet the community recreation needs. In addition, they argued that its location on the north side of Chinatown meant that it would be cut off from many of the vibrant residences and users on the south side of the street. The CDC wanted to develop a mixed-use community center instead that would create a space for recreation that was larger and had more capacity for volume. They also wanted to address the pedestrian barriers that were created by this highway that you see in the middle of the screen. Can you go to the next slide, please? This is a close-up of the crossing of that highway along 10th Street, which is our main commercial corridor. So you can see in this picture the Vine Tree Expressway running below, and the above the on-grade facings of Vine Street represent a very real pedestrian challenge, especially for seniors and for youth and children in the neighborhood. Next slide, please. This is some attempt to activate that plaza in the middle of the space. with activities such as mahjong that would draw people to use the space and make it feel more welcome and more accessible for pedestrians. Next slide, please. Similarly, this is a parklet activating a space that is typically used as a parking spot for cars on 10th Street. Again, trying to create these pockets of space where people can convene and gather and feel like you're activating that street life environment. Next slide. This is an image from a parade that was organized in 2018 to flag attention to the barriers that circled and bisected the neighborhoods, such as the highway. They wanted to highlight especially the senior and the children who had the most need to make the crossing every day because of the location of where the schools are on the north side of the highway and where their daycares are on the south side. And similarly, the access to the adjacent park, Franklin Square Park, on the east side of the neighborhood. So they did a parade that crossed those intersections and they shut down the street, creating that route both inside as well as outside of the town core area. Next slide, please. This is a close-up of one of the youth development groups, which promotes youth leadership through sports development as well as through community service. Next slide. And this is the end of the parade. They did a pop-up event, a festival all day at the corner of where that park was, where there is space that's owned by a local transit authority. So there's a lot of quasi-public spaces like this that are owned by public authorities, but that are not used by community members as public spaces. This was a reclamation of that parcel. And you can see the next slide, that was at the same festival event. The next slide, please. And then finally, this is the community center that was developed at the same time as that rail park that was proposed on the north side of the neighborhood. In the end, all these things happened, came to fruition. The community project was developed and completed. The rail park was developed and completed. And there was a cap for the Vine Street Expressway, the highway, that was submitted to the federal government, and they provided a grant to start planning around the future capping of the highway. And so, you know, we talk about community spaces. I think part of the takeaway I want to emphasize is that the governance and planning process of these community spaces were vastly different between the rail park and the more Asian and immigrant-driven community processes for space. How they defined those spaces were very different. How they planned around those spaces in terms of who would decide, who would benefit, and who would pay for those spaces was very different. And then also the broader implications for the community and its needs in supporting capacity building for other resources, for other goals in the community are very different. And so I think in terms of drawing this back to the question of, you know, if Chinatown is a living community, what does that mean for its public spaces and for its community spaces, is that there are many different lines of stakeholders that want to have a say. And it's very important to be intentional about the governance and the planning processes, to partner with community members and to build their capacity to be partners in that process, and also to be intentional in amplifying the equity analysis of that process, because of the historical marginalization of these communities and the effects of things such like urban renewal that came out of the public sector treating communities as if they were not worth being served and not worth being preserved. So I'll conclude my story there and make way for the next presenter, but looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Sarah. Sorry, I muted myself earlier. Yeah, so it's definitely the importance of governance of public spaces really ring very true here in Montreal as well. I'm just going to pass on to Winnie to share with us the story from Los Angeles. Winnie?
Thank you. I have a presentation to share. Just want to make a screen. Sorry. There you go. All right. Can
Awesome.
everyone see?
Okay. Yes, it's great.
Okay, thanks, Jessica, for having me, as well as everyone else in this esteemed panel. My name is Winnie. I am a board member of the LA Community Land Trust here in Los Angeles, and today I'll be sharing about our community's collective resilience against displacement. So we all know LA as the home of Hollywood, which uses Chinatown as a backdrop to portray something that is often exotic or foreign. Though sometimes it can be embraced by some of us locally, like this restaurant that proudly advertises that the Jackie Chan Rush Hour movie was filmed here. Also, the architecture and the colorful lanterns are attracted to tourists and visitors, but this all tends to overshadow, ignore the fact that Chinatown is actually a real community with real people and also complex issues, such as lack of affordable housing, tenant harassment, gentrification, and displaced businesses. And now we're seeing two competing visions of the future, of what the future of Chinatown should look like among existing community members as well as real estate developers. And this rapid gentrification that our neighborhood faces today with our inflicts both trauma and displacement on our current residents, which is not the first time this has happened before in Chinatown. It started with the 1871 Chinese massacre, one of the largest mass lynchings in US history, which many of the buildings in which the location of where it happened were demolished and completely wiped off the map. Over the years, the rest of the community in Old Chinatown thrived for the next 50 years with housing, restaurants, and shops, all up until it was torn down to make way for this Union Station terminal, which uprooted over 3,000 residents. And the government didn't help those who were displaced, so these community members self-funded and designed and built the new Chinatown to what it is today, which thrived for another 50 years up until newer Chinese enclaves started developing several miles in the suburbs, which neglected the Chinatown in this urban center. And that's when the Chinatown BID, the Business Improvement District, was formed in 2000. And their mission was, is to support local Chinese businesses as well as clean up the neighborhood. But the BID has other things in mind, such as abusing our unhoused neighbors, harassing legacy businesses, and serving the interests of wealthy developers, which attract real estate speculators, that openly encourages gentrification, like this broker listing here, that encourages the participation of rapid gentrification in Chinatown. And these newer developers are making Chinatown truly unrecognizable with these newer uses that do not serve the community, such as these creative office spaces. And not to mention this controversial gondola project proposed over Chinatown to transport the LA Dodgers baseball fans to the stadium over our homes and disrupting our quality of life. We're seeing that new market rate luxury residential developments are popping up in their neighborhoods, such as Jia Apartments, which includes 0 affordable units. And Jia means home in Chinese, which begs the question of whose home is it really for? Because now that landlords know how much rent is going for in these newer apartments, they are harassing our working class tenants, the immigrants of color, and evicting them by replacing them with tenants who can pay more in rent. And when the tenants rally to stay in their home, these predatory landlords tend to retaliate, such as vandalizing the apartment building with graffiti here, the picture on the right. They're also neglecting, there's also neglect against our elders. During the pandemic, the landlord in this building failed to fix the elevators at this senior housing apartment, forcing these seniors to walk up the stairs with their walkers and be trapped in their homes, unable to access groceries or visit the doctor. There's also demand for more safe and habitable housing conditions, such as the single resident occupancy buildings or SROs, where people share a communal kitchen and a bathroom. Here are the tenants here presenting their checks to their landlords, asking them to do the repairs and not raise their rents. And these higher rents in Chinatown are also pushing out essential businesses, such as this last remaining full-service grocery store, leaving residents feeling angry and helpless. Seniors will need to travel at least an hour by bus in order to access Asian groceries in the suburbs. Other businesses in Chinatown are also at risk, including the Dynasty Center, which is the last community shopping mall, which was recently brought out by a developer. This shopping mall has been around for many decades, selling everything from clothing, kitchenware, toys, jewelry. It is also home to many vendors and entrepreneurs who are Chinese immigrants and refugees from Southeast Asia. And their future is uncertain here, as many may be evicted at any time, such as this auntie here on the left. When I asked her, where is she going to go once the developer evicts you, she says the owner might close up shop. Elton here in the middle, who operates his family plant shop, says there's no place in Chinatown for them to go, so they would probably have to leave and go up to San Gabriel Valley. And Karen here on the right, she is not in the Dynasty Center, but her business is located across the street. And she's also uncertain about the future due to these big changes that are happening in the community. So in response to all of these threats and abuse in our neighborhood, we build collective power through our organizing, such as the Chinatown Community for Equitable Development, CCED here, which is a volunteer-led, multi-ethnic, intergenerational organization that provides education and mutual aid. They also support tenants, as well as local businesses, such as this neighborhood night market that is organized by and for the community. There's also SICA, the Southeast Asian Community Alliance, a youth leadership organization, which has shifted into a pandemic relief organization in 2020 and is now helping to advocate for deeper affordability for these newer housing development. As for our food insecurity, the Chinatown Teen Council, led by our local librarian, started a grocery distribution program back in 2019, where every month the teens will pack 100 bags of produce and deliver them directly to the homes of the single resident occupancies or occupants, which are mostly low-income seniors or individual working class individuals. And they are always happy to greet the teens at the door every time. And this is why we started the LA Chinatown Community Land Trust, where we promote permanent affordability and neighborhood stability through community ownership, where development is both equitable and community driven in order to build the world that we envision together. So I'll stop there and looking forward to some of the discussion questions after our presentations. So.
Thank you, Winnie. This whole question of who's Chinatown for and who's what are those current community issues really share across all Chinatowns. So I'm just going to quickly move over to Louisa-May, who is going to share with us some of the story from Singapore and Vancouver's Chinatown. Louisa-May?
Yeah. Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm gonna just quickly pop over and share my screen. Can you all see it?
Yes, awesome. It works
Awesome.
well.
All right, awesome. So thank you everyone for inviting me to be here. I would like to begin by first acknowledging that I am a guest zooming in from the unceded ancestral territory of the Coquitlam Nation here in BC, who have been custodians of these lands, of course, for centuries. So the pertinent question for today, who's Chinatown? Let me share some lessons and possibilities from Singapore and Vancouver. So if you have been to Singapore, Singapore's Chinatown is very, very pretty. It is a conserved district, colored predominantly blue on the zoning plan. It's indicative of its adaptive reuse as a commercial and tourist area. It has been kept pretty much fully intact, with the properties acquired, conserved, resold, repurposed. For Singapore, this was investment in posterity and, of course, the making of a global city. All residents who have been living in Chinatown since the 1980s have been relocated from Chinatown into public housing estates that the government has built in the fringes and outskirts of Singapore. But in this process, of course, something unmistakable has been lost. Keong Saik Road that you see here in Chinatown was infamous for its bars, gambling dens, brothels, street violence in the past, a very colorful area, but is now eerily silent as I face the closed-door uppity restaurants, boutique hotels. The date, 1929, that you see on the picture on the left is emblazoned on the white building. It is a reminder of how long brick and mortar can withstand the test of time. But bodies, on the other hand, are not as resilient. Urban renewals leave scars and wounds. The people are gone, Low says. Chinatown is made up of people, not buildings. You cannot put new shops, new businesses, flowers, banners, call it Chinatown. It will never be the same. Whatever is left is an artificial creation, an empty carcass. No more history, no more tradition. Now in late life, many former residents, like Low, find their way back as visitors because they can no longer afford to live or work there. So I see Uncle here again. He sits on the steps of Chinatown complex. He looks out onto the public plaza and the temple in the heart of the district. I first met Uncle several days earlier. I asked if he usually hung out here at Chinatown, and he replied rather despondently that yes, this is how retirement life was like, just past time. He said he lived nearby and he took a bus over. That day, in front of him, a group of students had gathered. You can see there in the picture on the left. They were likely on a historical tour led by a guide, and Uncle and the students pretty much shared a similar goal, right? They both wanted to recreate stories from the past. Captured textbook heritage retold by the guide was probably more accurate. The other set of stories lie buried in minds, in seniors' memories, protected, likely incoherent, partial, subjective, but lived. So I venture further along and I hear the occasional Hokkien swear words which will ring through the air when the men reach a feverish pitch in their chess and checker games. They cannot quite help themselves. So the 5-foot way is packed with bodies. One can imagine these same bodies, 50 years younger, along these same 5-foot ways in Chinatown, watching the world go by, hoot whistling the girls walking past. There were no more food calls that day. These aging bodies seem out of place in a postcard pretty tourist attraction. Weathered, they cannot be prettied up like the shophouses can. In September 1998, the Singapore Tourism Board announced a $97 million plan to revitalize Chinatown. They transformed the immigrant residential enclave towards the needs of the tourism industry, worthy of a global city. From the government's perspective, spaces need to evolve as times change, and those who cannot compete would then have to give way to those who can survive. And this was, of course, exactly what happened. Singapore is not alone in how historic places fall prey to world-making pursuits. Other Chinatowns, like Vancouver's here, run the risk of disappearing altogether with a lack of funding to shore up conservation works of heritage buildings. Indeed, one could argue that if the Singapore government had not taken the lead, then the conservation and adaptive reuse could not have happened, since owners would not have been incentivized or have the wherewithal to fund the renovation works or have the expertise to do so. At least the built heritage survives, so aging bodies like Uncle can return to Chinatown day after day and sit on the steps. But unlike Singapore's Chinatown, Vancouver's Chinatown has a large live-in population. Yet, city governments seem unable to find the muscle to stem the tide of gentrification, as we have been hearing. And worse, the area has become unsafe as fires have ravaged the single-room accommodations. The area is vandalized, and the living community becomes increasingly the target of anti-Asian hate crimes. In contrast, most of the land in Singapore during the colonial days had been owned, of course, by a small ring of businessmen and by the British and by British-linked companies. But today, however, Singaporeans own about 80% of the homes that they live in. In 1966, this was because there was a Land Acquisition Act that was passed, which provided the Singapore government with broad powers to secure private land for public benefit, primarily to build these housing estates that you see. The parliamentary minutes that were recorded at that time said, "This prevents an iron ring of landlords who do nothing but suck from the poor and hold posterity up to highway robbery." This draconian, but I would argue, Robin Hood move by the state redistributed the unequal allocation of resources of land, legacies left by a colonial city. This reset button became a social leveler for the many coolies who arrived in Singapore with nothing but the shirt on their backs, like my grandfather. I never quite understood the significance of this until I worked with the Chinatown community here in Vancouver and saw for myself the many seniors who continue to live in dormitory-style precarious rental units in SROs in the downtown east side. The oldest living there is 94 years old. Many have lived in Vancouver Chinatown all their lives, frozen in a sort of time capsule where their material well-being has little changed, even as the country progressed. They or their parents would have been in the same generation as my grandfather who left China a century ago. The destinations were different, but the outcomes have been too. In January this year, I helped the Chinatown community and the city of Vancouver put together the Vancouver Chinatown Seniors Affordable Housing Inventory. It showed that less than a quarter of all the affordable housing stock in Chinatown and the downtown east side were designated for seniors, about 3,000 units. There are some 7,000 seniors living in the area, which means that more than half of these seniors are unsuitably housed. Seniors suffer the brunt of the housing crisis since they are multiply varied, right? By income, by race, by age, by gender. It is therefore no surprise that the homeless count is also showing rising proportion of seniors. As aging accelerates, this situation is going to be more dire. Vancouver Chinatown has stated intentions to become a UNESCO heritage site, where seniors as living heritage are an essential component and ought to be protected. Yet strategies have not quite matched intention. A large segment of the living community, especially seniors, continue to live in the neighborhood they have always known, but in extreme precarity. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. I have so many questions just listening to your presentation, Louisa-May. These contrasting case studies between Singapore and Vancouver and a lot of North American Chinatowns it really raised the question about who's Chinatown for, what is the state's intention, and how that intersects with the execution with community on the ground, as earlier Sarah and Winnie both mentioned. So we're going to listen to the last presentation, the story from Chiu from right here in Montreal. Then we're going to dive into this conversation of whose Chinatown it is. May?
Hi, good morning, everybody. Okay, I have to read my presentation really fast to respect the time limit. And so I decided to tell my story about what I did this summer, what I witnessed actually this summer. So this year, I have never been to so many events or followed so many news stories about homelessness and security. The Chinatown Roundtable organized a public meeting on these subjects, as did the City of Montreal, aid organizations, cohabitation forums, and in Chinatown, there were press conferences all summer long. The themes were always the same: homelessness and security. And these two separate issues are always quoted together, as if unhoused people are solely responsible for insecurity in Chinatowns and other parts of Montreal neighborhoods. But I learned a lot by listening, and I would like to share some of my learnings with you all. First, it is important to listen to housed people, no matter where they are on the hierarchy of privileges. In our Western democracy, they are the ones who will go out and vote. And as we have seen throughout history, it is so easy for authoritarian governments to be swept into power by scapegoating. Once again, when governments refuse to respect their human rights obligations, people are easily pitted against one another. Issues of security and homelessness are able to unite privileged white people and vulnerable Chinese people, such as seniors. These issues are even able to nudge a racialized community into calling for the over-policing and over-surveillance of their own neighborhood. How do we build the appropriate alliances? When we advocated for more social services as a solution, someone shot back, "I hope you are asking for social services for Chinese seniors. They are the vulnerable ones." "Yes," I replied, "we have been fighting to maintain our only Chinese community center, which provides social services to our seniors, because it is at the risk of closing due to unsubstantiated allegations of being a Chinese police station by the RCMP. Watching people suffer from trauma can itself be traumatizing. I have spoken with house residents expressing anxiety from constantly witnessing unhygienic conditions, verbal and physical assaults, and being threatened by desperate, marginalized people. While the NIMBY, the not in my neighborhood solution approach, is not a solution, I can understand people who seek immediate relief. I also learned that it is so easy to devalue human life. All summer long, headlines touted the warnings of one Chinese organization: "Chinatown is a ticking time bomb," and everyone mobilized around calling the city to act before something terrible happened. When we point out that the worst had already happened, as evidenced by approximately 6 deaths in Chinatown in less than a year, nobody cared, because the lives of marginalized people don't have the same weight as housed people. Even a suicide is a pretext to call for more policing, as if suicide was a criminal act rather than a mental health crisis. In 2 different neighborhoods, I have heard an analogy between unhoused people and immigrants. Parallels are drawn between our capacity to integrate more shelters and our capacity to integrate newcomers. Of course, the argument is that society cannot absorb more immigrants or homeless people, regardless of how much inequality between developed and underdeveloped countries and the social inequities responsible for these phenomena. Long forgotten is Chinatown as a place of refuge, a place where marginalized people congregated, a place founded by marginalized people. Long forgotten is that over 100 years ago, during the exclusion years, as the numbers of Chinese immigrants were stunted, the red light district was established alongside Montreal's Chinatown, and it became an attraction for socially questionable activities such as gay bars, gambling, mob activities. There are even news reports of tunnels connecting different buildings in our Chinatown so that Chinese people could escape from police raids. We have forgotten that we were once the undesirables who were victims of police and immigration raids. However, I would like to conclude with the most insightful lesson I learned from one house resident. It was at a meeting by a new social service organization in the neighborhood well known for tensions with a marked presence of unhoused indigenous population. The meeting showcased the dysfunctionalism of the current social service system and offered a new model that centered around the needs of the clientele. Outreach workers gave advice on how to interact with the unhoused, how to communicate by recognizing people's dignity. To me, it sounded like that most participants had really good intentions. However, near the end of the meeting, as a group of residents spoke, I braced myself for yet another round of calls for a social cleansing of marginalized people from the public sphere. Again, the house residents described the incivilities, the noise at all hours of the night, the criminal activities, public drug use, aggression, the sex trafficking of women, scenes we see all over the city. However, as I listened to the final speaker continue to describe the intolerable scenes he witnessed every day, at last, I understood his message as he questioned the effectiveness of the social service system. He was actually coming from a place of great humanity, as his essential question was, how do we even begin to repair the damage caused by 500 years of colonization? And coming from my Chinatown, which surrounds an indigenous shelter and whose unhoused population includes a lot of BIPOC people, it made me ask the question, how does Chinatown fit into all of this? So that concludes my prepared presentation. And I just want to end with this picture of Ronnie K. As you can see, he died on September 17th, a year ago. He was killed by the Montreal police during an intervention after a distress call. His family to this day have no explanation as to why he was killed by the police, what happened. They are left in complete darkness. And the reason why I wanted to close with Ronnie's photo is that right outside our Chinatown house, where we're hosting our forum for the next, during these 3 days, today, there is a police recruiting booth across the street in the park where we will be celebrating tomorrow. Sorry, it's tomorrow that is happening, the police recruiting booth. So I just wanted to pay homage to Ronnie K and to let his family know that we will continue to support them in their quest for justice. Thanks.
Thank you, May. And with that, we are going to dive, I can't wait for us to dive into the discussion with our panels. Yeah, because May, your presentation really started to recrystallize this question of who's Chinatown for? And if the narrative of Chinatown, and as we all know, we don't want our narrative of Chinatown to be so simplistic as just a tourist destination or just a postcard, as Louisa-May mentioned, then who is Chinatown for? And how do we define those critical community issues that seems to we are all facing? There are common challenges in different Chinatowns. So I want to kind of dive into a little bit about this question and who is Chinatown for, based on your experience in working with different Chinatowns. That May just mentioned about this dichotomy in terms of the house, between the house and unhoused population. And this dialogue obviously is pretty common in different Chinatowns. Anybody want to kind of dive into that a little bit in your work on this question of who's Chinatown? Who is Chinatown for? Maybe Louisa-May, you want to mention it a bit with your story. Singapore. When I first heard the way when you are comparing Singapore and Vancouver, I found it very striking. It's like Singapore's Chinatown basically took some of an approach of Chinatown revitalization to a full mark. Like they actually really went all the way. And then while some of our Chinatown in North America are discussing what that would look like, and then we can actually look to Singapore's Chinatown. Would you like to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Jessica. I mean, in some sense, the state went in a very big way to conserve the entire Chinatown. I mean, it was investment par excellence. Their huge mistake was to put it lock, stock, and barrel to the tourism board to actually oversee the revitalization. And so it became a tourist attraction, right? And I think right now, I think on hindsight, the planners do recognize that they have made a bit of a mistake there. They should have seized a bit more control in terms of how they wanted the revitalization to and to keep a lot more of the lived-in population, but that is of course now a foregone conclusion. But I think what is heart-wrenching is what you see today in the streets and in the alleyways of Chinatown, where the old people, so these former residents from all over Singapore, will every day just take the bus back and come back and just linger in Chinatown, because what else do they have to hang on to? At least they have the brick and mortar that they can stare at, and maybe they will have some vendors here and there, familiar ones who they grew up with, who are still there in the hawker centers, for instance. But all they otherwise have is memories. And so you see this interesting juxtaposition of the tourist bodies and from all over the world, and these seniors, local seniors who are hanging out in Chinatown. As compared to, for instance, some of the stories I'm hearing now from North America, which is quite different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think for me, that's a it makes me think about not just the stakeholder groups, the seniors and the unhoused, and others that we frequently mention when we talk about Chinatown, but thinking about them as a system and how they're connected. That in itself having value to preserve. And so I think what that means in terms of community engagement and community impact is, you have to insist on the inclusion of the small businesses and the associations as part of that discussion, and be aware of all of those connective tissues, because ultimately they are anchored by culture, and that in itself has a lot of external value for the region, for the city. So thinking about them not just as, folks in need, folks without a home, folks displaced, but also thinking about them as creating this constellation, this center of gravity that can be incredibly powerful for the community and for the region. And, I think our Chinatowns are all in different kind of cycles of diminishment and places of strength and weakness in terms of that, the strength of that system. But I think that's kind of the potential success of that. And so thinking about who's Chinatown, it's having an understanding that Chinatown is a collection, and the relationships within that collection, that's what Chinatown is. So, I think oftentimes the public sector is very gun shy when it comes to understanding that and engaging the community in that way, because they feel like they may not have a sense of that, how to engage those individual stakeholders, as well as what does that mean for the whole community. And also the focus is not always on the value of preserving and further, encouraging its success if it is weak.
This reminds me of yesterday at our post-film screening. We have a panel discussion and then talk about this whole idea of Chinatown values. And that is actually, it's the people and it's the relationship that made Chinatown Chinatown. It's not, and so in that, I'm just thinking about what May you raised in terms of the issue of the needed services that often are a lot broader than Chinatown. It will need to take a lot broader approach and engagement in terms of resources allocation to serve the needs, and the needs are always so big. what can be our strategies in tackling that while we kind of working on the ground or on more at the grassroots on the ground? May you want to kind of expand a little bit from earlier you mentioned some of your observations or you've been seeing in the past few months?
Oh boy, it's always an uphill battle. Like the question is like, how do you fight white supremacists, colonialism and structure? You know, it's a hard struggle, and it takes the grassroots, it takes grassroots mobilization, and it takes some people who are able to make the links between the different struggles that are going on. Like I was saying, I think a lot of people who are so pro-police, they forget about our history, but once you start the dialogue with them, at least they were, you know, they were kind enough on the anniversary of Ronnie K's killing 2 weeks ago not to post any pro-police publicity. So like that's one starting point, is just, you know, telling our story, getting back to our history, getting back to our commonalities. And then your next panel is about building inter-community solidarities. And yesterday, in our sharing circle, like I raised the story about, you know, the RCMP's xenophobia, their disability to basically shut down our only existing community center in Montreal for Chinese seniors. And, you know, and I saw Ellen Gabriel, who's a land defender, you know, nod her head, because I said, well, as you might remember, RCMP has not exactly been an ally. In fact, it's the opposite. They are have always been actively taking part in oppressing Indigenous rights. And I think it is through building that inter-community solidarity and the relationship where we can arrive at something. In Montreal's Chinatown, there is also a more visible proportion of homeless people who are Black. And again, if you look at if you talk to the Black community, they reject the label of them being settlers at all. They were brought here originally as slaves. And again, you know, they suffer from like hundreds of years of slavery and the effects of slavery, and also intergenerational trauma. So, you know, I think we need to educate each other about where people are coming from, and build on our commonalities.
That's a really good segue. I'm just looking at the chat. There's one question. It leads to this whole idea of what is state's intention, right? Like kind of what Louisa-May you mentioned earlier, and then Winnie, you talk about how LA's Chinatown has always been the backdrop. That's when people think about LA is Hollywood and all that, and how do we counter that type of broader narrative that obviously has all sorts of consequences in terms of how policies are made, the process, the resources are allocated. So in the idea of we are going to advocate for more community-driven type of planning processes, what is the best way to interact with the government? Sarah, you mentioned some of the project in Philadelphia in terms of public spaces. Maybe Winnie, you want to expand a bit on this idea of interfacing between community-driven approach planning and the state's role.
Yeah, I think the role of the state should support a community-driven process that is inclusive and that values those with lived experience in the community, as well as working closely with community-based organizations to help ground truth some of that data and the information to use and craft meaningful and effective policies. It's important to gauge and receive their community feedback and meet people to where they are. Most people are working multiple jobs. They're just struggling to survive. They can't attend meetings and childcare. I also think in our city, our city council should really understand who's in the community and provide materials and language support. For example, in Chinatown, we we speak Chinese. We also, within Chinese, we have three different dialects, right? Cantonese, Toisan, and as well as Chiu. And there's also Vietnamese, Khmer, and Spanish. So if you are going to translate materials and invite someone who speaks Chinese but is a Mandarin translator, they're not going to understand, right? Also at the firm that I work at Solano Advisors, what we do is we propose more equitable economic development, which includes various approaches where we work with development and public agencies to craft better policies, such as community benefits agreement, how to safeguard some of the development of our community through things like affordable housing or local hire, more inclusionary housing so we can increase more affordable housing in our community. I also think in terms of the state, what we could see from there is obviously funding, but also publicly owned land and also political will. I can give you some examples of some of the things that is happening on the ground. For example, one tenant association here is advocating our city to use eminent domain to preserve their 120-unit affordable housing building. Their affordability covenant expired and the owner is increasing the rent by 200%. An eminent domain is basically a legal way for the government to acquire land for fair compensation and then convert it to public ways. And historically, it has been used for infrastructure that benefits the wealthy. So this is a new precedent that if it's successful, it could be used to protect our working class residents and support housing justice.
Interesting. And Louisa-May, you would like to respond to that?
Yeah, I think I'll jump in and also address a question in the chat that was on planning processes. So one of the ways in which we tried to come into the narrative in the Vancouver, Chinatown sort of aging housing, seniors housing work that we were doing was really to say that if you get aging right, like if you do aging right in Chinatown, things will find its own balance. Right? Because you do have a huge living community there, not just Chinese seniors. In fact, Chinatowns are very multicultural. So Vancouver Chinatown, within the downtown East Side area, it's 50% white. And of course, the Chinese form a majority minority population, but you also have a lot of Latin Americans, Southeast Asians, South Asians, Africans. And they are all aging, right? Because these are the historic districts. And so as the brick and mortar age, the inhabitants age. And also to sort of say that if you do the urban infrastructure well, you are going to see payoffs in health costs down the line. So do the infrastructure well, right? Upgrade your areas, make it livable, thrivable for people to age in. If you don't do it now, and when you see the aging hump go up, you're going to be in deep trouble. And of course, these historic areas are, of course, a microcosm of what you're going to see when when we reach a super aged society. So get it done right. So there are some bits of ways where some of it is coming through. It's like one step forward, two step back. So in the BD proposal for 105 Kiefer, which was finally approved without any social housing, without any seniors housing, even though you had 80 people speaking up for it, and 5 people only saying, yes, we should go the way of the development. It was a bit of a shot in the foot, right? Given that this inventory had also come up just right before the decision was taken. Yeah, so there was a need to align strategies with said intention.
Sarah?
Hi, yes, raising my hand. I think this is a Canadian panel, so I've never had to do that before. But just in response to Louisa-May, I think we're all at a point in city planning and in the history of our cities where people are starting to recognize that the focus on the physical infrastructure has been to the loss of our social infrastructure and the community infrastructure. And we're all trying to figure out what that new path forward looks like. Our cities, I think many of our cities are now in a lot of struggle. We're, in this cycle of downturn and upturn economically, we're in a downturn. There are a lot of challenges that come alongside with that. And so there's a lot of pressures on decision makers from the public sector to be responsive to that, as well as to accommodate the kind of social network and community concerns that we're raising. And so I think it's important, nobody has the answers. I think it's important to partner to treat this as a partnership between the public sector and the community. And I think that means some accommodation on both sides for the public sector to kind of, recognize the pressures on all sides, but also to be a little bit more open to understanding and taking a more systems approach that will value what the potential is in our Chinatowns. And then I think on the community side, also understanding kind of the higher level concerns that because of the nature where these Chinatowns are, they're in downtown areas now. They're no longer in the red districts and the unwanted places of our cities. There are a lot of different pressures that have citywide implications. And so, it's not just about a single family or a single set of families and businesses, but there are broader implications for the region. And that is that's staggering and overwhelming kind of prospect for everybody to be looking at. And so we have to work together about the relationship and the conversation to find our way forward.
May, you want to respond to that a little bit in terms of that relationship and a lot of the issues we want to take earlier? You mentioned the human rights approach to this and unpacking these systemic issues that causing the past, I don't know how so long. How do we unpack that and take a human rights approach, take an aging in place approach, aging rights approach? I think we have some sort of convergence around that. But how do we unpack that on our day-to-day management and dealing with the system?
Oh boy. Again, for me, it all comes back to grassroots organizing, and the victories that we've had in being able to preserve and obtain heritage status for Montreal's Chinatown. It came like actually surprisingly. Jessica, you were part of the mobilization movement. And I think at one point you said, because you have experience in Vancouver's Chinatown, and I think you had mentioned at one point, wow, like this, we had a big win in like less than 2 years of hard mobilization, and nobody expected it. But the lesson that I draw from this is that, so our mobilization did not start with Chinatown. It didn't start in 2019, anti-racism, anti-Asian racism activism had existed for years before that. We learned from everybody who was involved in fighting for the head tax redress, and so we never let our guard down because and as we all see in the news and in the political circle now. We thought after COVID, we'll have some relief from anti-Asian racism and xenophobia, and then pop comes up, foreign agent registry, we have to be watch out for these like Asian-looking people who have connections with China, and we've got to survey them. So like we can never let down our guard, and at the same time, because of our vigilance, when the time is right and we happen to have a friendly government in power, everything came together. And
Mhm.
we would not have had the victory that we had, I think, with the former city administration. And we were really lucky. This administration was open and wanted to collaborate with us, and they also saw the value of Chinatown. And I think that all the bureaucrats that we're working with are also understanding like the shared values, not only for Chinatown, but I think, you know, the intrinsic value of community building following, you know, 2 really hard years of pandemic crisis. And I think someone just now, maybe Winnie or Sarah, was mentioning that we haven't come out of crisis mode yet. And I think with the climate crisis, I don't think we will. So now more than ever, we need to continue to work together based on the Chinatown values that we were talking about, you know, intercommunity solidarity, the need to continue the struggle, the need to call out racism and oppression, etc.
Thank you. So I'm just thinking about this, you know, we are shaping a narrative to trying to understand Chinatown as a living community, and looking at one question asked about this trend, and this it's a trend kind of push to have Chinatown Museum, Chinatown Story Center, to really that as a tool for Chinatown revitalization in North America. And this just kind of made me think about what Winnie, in the beginning, you opened up your presentation about that. And that was actually, so I want to kind of dive into that a little bit. Our panel title is Chinatown is not a museum, but and then storytelling, preservation, heritage conservation, that's a big part of it. And anybody want to kind of expand a little bit on that, how living heritage, I think what we are talking about Chinatown as a living community, living heritage, especially our seniors, are kind of knowledge holders, and you know, how do we strike the balance between that, and then whether these trends are moving into more and more focused resources going into storytelling and museum. It's how can we benefit from it in the advocacy for living community type of approach to Chinatown. Who wants to take that one on? This is a question from the audience.
I can start and share a little bit about what we're doing here in LA. We do have the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, which is actually located in an old Victorian home that was built in newer Chinatown, which archives a lot of information. When they raised Union State, the old Chinatown, to build new Chinatown, they actually found artifacts on the ground, which they displayed in the museum. And I just want to put here in the chat, this is coming soon. They're thinking about doing an augmented reality experience where they bring the old Chinatown back to life in Union Station. So looking forward to seeing that. But something that we want to look at is how do we designate our Chinatown historical preservation and protect our buildings from being demolished. So,
May?
I think, oh, sorry.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Sarah, go first.
Okay, Sarah, go ahead.
Sorry, I forgot to raise my hand.
Different style of facilitation. Go ahead, Sarah. Welcome
You're
to
so
Canada.
Chinese, you're not standing in line.
So just to respond to you saying about the museum, you know, it's really fascinating to watch that, you know, kind of formal presentation of history and culture emerge out of our Chinatowns, different Chinatowns. I think in response to the question about, you know, living Chinatown, what does that mean? To be able to share that and preserve that, you know, that presentation culture, that's always changing, right? Because culture is always changing. And here in our Chinatown, I think one of the things that makes us unique is that we have experienced an influx of new immigrants into the neighborhood that's taking over ownership of businesses and properties. and creating their own, producing their own culture, shifting the answer to the question of what makes Chinatown Chinatown. That's always changing, and so that part of cultural preservation, should be tended to and cared for in as much intention as we look at museums as these formal places to share and as meeting grounds for people to kind of come back and learn and absorb and then go forth and create their own culture. So, as a living place, we can be thoughtful about both the formal structures of preservation as well as these social business and community networks where that culture is always uh, originating from.
Right?
Okay, I'm going to answer this question from another angle. So the question is it a contradiction, between saying Chinatown's not a museum and the demands of the community's needs to establish a museum? So just very quickly, we had, by we, I mean the Chinatown Roundtable, we had a white French, like a white Francophone male member who was extremely active in the organization, who was really excited to meet the community and to be involved. And at a certain point in time, he became really frustrated with the fact that we were only always speaking about Chinese history. And in the end, he left because he was so critical of the fact that how come when you're doing Chinatown storytelling, how come when you're talking about the history of Chinatown, you don't include white Francophone history? And I'm like, oh my God, if you want like white history, just open any history book, go to any library, go to any school and open this history book that is public, and you will see white people's history all over the place. We don't have any space. Our history is not taught anywhere. So hell yes, we do need Chinatown museums and Chinatown storytelling centers. You just made our point, Bud.
Louisa-May? You do have a Chinese Canadian museum just freshly opened in Vancouver and also have a storytelling center.
Yes, I just want to address maybe the elephant in the room.
Great.
With the Singapore example, the North American examples, which is really that in Singapore, it was a non-white settler colony, right? The whites came, the whites conquered Southeast Asia, made it their colonies, but left, right? And so, which is quite different in North American Chinatowns. So I think you have a larger problem in that sense because you are embedded within the larger historical legacies that continue to pervade anything you do. And so it is so much tougher. But also to say that while I recognize the need for museums in terms of it is still but an orientalized sort of figment of sometimes the Western imagination, right? And I think there is a need to also own and live our culture, right? Not just memorialize it, right? And by that, I mean that the young generation, for instance, have to live their culture, have to recognize that it's important. So we are seeing an interesting movement in Singapore as well, where all the clan associations are actually making a comeback for some reason. Like they've all been chased out of Chinatown because they cannot afford rents, but they've gone virtual. And they have started recruiting the youngsters, and the youngsters are starting to pick up the dialects, and they are starting to celebrate a lot of the operas and all that in schools. And you see all these little pop-ups that come up on the streets and all that. And the youths are coming out to do a lot of these Chinese drama and wuxia and whatever on the public spaces. So I think it is up to us to live that history now, not keep it as history, because then it's what a living community is about. right? It's not just the seniors who have it in their heads, but it's also us, right? So while we might be hybridized and westernized and whatever you call it, who are we? I think that is the question we also have to ask ourselves. Yeah, I think I'll just end there.
That's actually a great segue when you're talking about who are we. Just also remind me of a point that yesterday after our film screening, we talked about how Chinatown is like it's a different breed. It's not just Chinese, it's not Asian Chinese. So that Louisa-May, you clearly kind of identify this difference. The Chinese diaspora ended up in different parts of the world and how it kind of evolved the history and then issues kind of unfold differently. And then who are we? We are kind of this new group of the Chinatown culture, which is very uniquely North American. And you mentioned living the heritage right now. We should live it now. That's why it's living community. It's kind of connect up to this another question from the audience about we talk about aging in place, but how about the youth and the intergenerational activity in Montreal? We are very fortunate. We saw, even in putting this forum together, it's incredible amount of youth volunteer getting involved to get this whole forum is mostly volunteer run and very grassroots. So how do we make sure our effort include that intergenerational and have activity and have the space for the younger generation be part of it? Any one of you want to touch on that a bit in terms of your work in your respective cities in the connection, intergenerational aspect? Like we have people, we want seniors, we want them to be able to age in dignity and great with aging rights. The young people who are searching for their connection and a sense of belonging at this space. And then this, I think yesterday I was chatting with Lan Yi, this visual artist who's helping us to putting all our in-person exhibitions, talk about, it's like this ripple of Chinatown community is growing. We talk about young people, maybe is the queer community, all these people different people want to feel a sense of belonging in this space. And how do we make sure that ripple keep growing bigger? I'm hoping, looking at the time, and I'm hoping to end on this Chinatown as a living community on this intergenerational issue. So maybe we go around the panel to end our panel discussion on this question.
I can go first. So the Chinatown Roundtable is a multi-sectorial platform, and we have representatives of our seniors, such as the family associations, and we have a seat especially for youth. And I have to say the youth have taken amazing initiative. So including, the artists, a lot of them are artists, some young professionals, and maybe just to say, we have really amazing performances to close our forum on Saturday evening. So among the presentations are a couple of drag performances, and I was putting up posters with the organizer of that activity, who is like a sexual minority and a performer and a dancer. And he reached out to me specifically because he said, how do I distribute these posters in the Chinese seniors' residences? I don't know where they are. Can you help me? And so we went around, we talked to the seniors on the street, and they were all really excited. So I think that's like a really lovely initiative on the part of that youth. I just want to end also by mentioning that another group of youth who are coming to Chinatown to to explore identity are the adopted Chinese youth, who now are young adults, and they have a lot of questions about being raised in white families, but being racial minorities, and then trying to find a place for themselves in our Chinatowns. And again, a lot of them talked about wanting to find like a Chinese grandmother substitute, like a popo. And a lot of them are like thrilled about learning mahjong so that they can have social interaction with our seniors. So I'm very hopeful in terms of being able to continue these generational, but also intercultural bridge building.
Wonderful. Winnie?
Yeah, I'll give two examples. Both I mentioned in the presentation earlier. We have a very active Chinatown Teen Council, which is led by our local library. So it's the most active in our city, actually. It started with 20 students in the community to over 200. Even teens located outside of Chinatown wanting to give back to the community. And also supporting them in their own professional development. And they even just released a podcast that they put together where they interviewed one of our board members, Yeung, to talk about the history of Chinatown, as also the gentrification and talking about those social issues that are happening. And then secondly, I do want to highlight the Chinese or the Chinatown Community for Equitable Development, CCED, which I mentioned is multicultural and intergenerational group of folks who come together. We're always coming out in these site bites to rally folks to fight the gentrification that's happening, and to see everyone across generations come up holding signs all in different languages. And our seniors who come out also in support in these site bites and rallies, and they're fearless, which is great. So hope to see more of that, and also seeing that that cross-racial solidarity in our very diverse communities here in Los Angeles.
Looking forward to actually on that point, the second panel coming up, we are going to delve into that even more. Sarah?
So I love this question because Chinatown is such a long-term thinking community. It's a historic community, right? And our Chinatown's 163 years old. They think about not the next 5 years, but also the next 100 years. And so I think I'm going to reverse what I've been talking about, the social networks and the public infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, and say, ultimately Chinatown is a gathering space. It's a physical anchor. There is a minimal amount that needs to, a minimal impact presence that needs to have in order to still hold people around it, whether or not they live nearby or not. It matters that there are things that are located there. There are people that do live there and offices that do hold these activities. And so I think for the youth, thinking about how to create places in our infrastructure for them, spaces for them to gather, spaces for them to be, the next residents, the next business owners, et cetera, and giving them the tools and capacity to be the next generation, because it's about the life cycle of a community. And so thinking about our infrastructure in that way, planning for that continuance of vitality that will ultimately, preserve a living community. That would be the first thing that comes to mind.
And Louisa-May, since you got up so early in the West Coast to join us, I'm going to give you the last word.
Okay, yeah, maybe I'll sum up and go back to what Sarah said right in the beginning, where Chinatown is an ecosystem. And I thought maybe let's sum it up this way. I think the hardware is important. I'm appalled that 90-year-olds have to climb stairs and have lived in the spaces like that's just not acceptable. Like, something has to be done. It's just not acceptable at any level, at any color of your skin. So the infrastructure has to be done well. That's the hardware. The software, it means that you have to have the programs, the activation, the social networks at all levels, intergenerationally, right? So that the Chinatown community can continue to be a lived community. And I think the hardware, right? The what's inside of you, like Chinatown has to live on for the next 100 years, right? And even if all the buildings fall apart, like who are we as Chinese in a North American society? Like, what does this mean for our generations and the future generations of Chinese Americans, Chinese Canadians? What does being Chinese mean in a North American society? I think that is what will then hold Chinatown together as the ecosystem in the heart. We're part of it. Yeah, so maybe I'll just sum it up that way. Thank you.
That's a great summary, because that's a great context. The first opening panel we're going to talk about the software in the second panel coming up. The third panel today, we're going to talk about the hardware in terms of some of the nitty-gritty community real estate solutions that we slightly touched on today. And then tomorrow, we have two remaining panels. We'll start to talk about activation of the spaces with culture and small business as backbone of Chinatown, and the cross intersection between storytelling and placemaking. So on that, I'm going to thank everybody for joining us, and take a break and stay tuned. In half an hour, please join us back here again for the second panel. And thank you for our great panelists today and opening up our conversation nicely today. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.